call it a good start for the federal government in the process of seeking redress to overturn the $9.6 billion judgment in the favor of Process and Industrial Development Limited, P&ID, and you may not be entirely wrong. That's the description the federal government is giving to the stay of execution order it secured today at the UK Commercial and Arbitration Court. With the leave to appeal the judgment secured, there is perhaps yet another opportunity for Nigeria to cross other hurdles. Our correspondent Juliana Olayinka now reports.
How does Nigeria begin to resolve a $9.6 billion years-old arbitration case? Earlier today, a UK judge granted Nigeria an opportunity to overturn the ruling of this high-stakes case of a collapsed gas deal that could cost Nigeria 2.5% of its GDP. In August, a British judge ruled that the government must begin the release of its assets to the small energy company Process and Industrial Developments, a company founded by two Irishmen and is registered in the British Virgin Islands, a British overseas territory. The case centres around a 2009 contract for P&ID to build a pipeline to carry the gas to a refinery, but it was never completed. P&ID said it spent $40 million on the project, a claim disputed by Nigeria. Since the summer ruling, Nigeria have stepped up its defence. Arrests have been made, and the government have launched a bid for the extradition of P&ID figureheads. This week, senior officials arrived in the UK in a bid to settle this matter once and for all.
The beauty of it is that time does not run against fraud. If your basis for challenging a contract or an arbitration award is on grounds of fraud, it does not matter when this comes up. And we've been able to discover that there are a lot of monetary inducement between the parties, between some officials of the Ministry of Petroleum Resources and the P&ID.
This is far from over. Nigeria has been ordered to pay $200 million to the British court within 60 days, or asset seizures will begin. During today's proceedings, lawyers representing Nigeria said that the judgment was flawed, primarily due to its acceptance that England was the proper seat of the arbitration. The Nigerian government insists that debunked P&ID contract represents fraud, irregularity, and illegality. Juliana Olayinka, Channels Television News.
Meanwhile, the Minister of Justice and Attorney General of the Federation, Mr. Abubakar Malami, says that the country's legal team will study the court rulings, exercise the right of appeal and consider the legal options available as it relates to the payment of $200 million in view of the 60-day window stipulated by the court. He says, "I am pleased with today's development in the court and see this as a positive resolution that contributes an important step in the government's efforts to defend itself in a fair and just process. We look forward to challenging the UK Commercial Court's recognition of the tribunal's decision in the UK Courts of Appeal on covering P&ID's outrageous approach for what it is, a sham based on fraudulent and criminal activity developed to profit from a developing country." A British court had on August the 16th granted the small private company access to seize up to $9.6 billion in assets belonging to the Nigerian government. That sum is about 20% of the country's foreign reserves. This judgment came about after the company sued the federal government over a failed deal to build a natural gas plant. Back in Nigeria and still staying with the courts, the convener of #RevolutionNow protest and former AAC presidential candidate, Mr. Omoyele Sowore, has filed a contempt suit against the Director General of the Department of State Services, Yusuf Bichi, for allegedly disobeying a court order granting him bail. The legal team of Mr. Sowore, led by Mr. Femi Falana, also filed an affidavit of compliance with the order of the court and had same served on the DSS. Justice Taiwo had granted bail to Mr. Sowore on Tuesday after his being detained by the DSS for over 45 days was allegedly calling for a revolution through the protest that was scheduled for September the 5th. Meanwhile, the DSS has denied claims that it is disobeying the court order. DSS Public Relations Officer Peter Afunanya told our correspondent that Mr. Sowore is yet to perfect the conditions for release. A claim Mr. Femi Falana has also faulted, insisting that all the conditions have been met. President Muhammadu Buhari says that the socio-economic costs of illicit financial flows will continue to stunt the growth of developing countries if nothing is done. That perhaps explains why he's seeking ways to stem the tide through international collaborations on the sidelines of the United Nations General Assembly in New York. The president and other participants at the forum worried that without a global and collective solution to illicit flows of funds, it will be difficult to achieve sustainable development goals by the year 2030. Our correspondent Ibrahim Adra reports.
President of the United Nations General
President Buhari is joined by presidents of Ethiopia and Zambia and the president of the UN General Assembly. The issue at hand is of concern to participants, particularly those from the developing nations. The estimated figures that flow out illegally is enormous.
Over 200 billion United States dollars per year is being lost by developing country, tries when multinational enterprises do not pay taxes in the countries where they made the profit. Between 2003 and 2012, Nigeria lost about 157.5 billion United States dollars to illicit financial flows.
These outflows leave countries broke and underdeveloped.
The immediate impact is reduction of domestic expenditure and both public and private investment. The excessive losses from illicit financial flows include fewer hospitals and schools, fewer police officers on the street, fewer roads and bridges, etc.
This meeting is to take stock of efforts and explore opportunities for international collaboration.
All of you. This is no longer an issue for Africa. Many countries have seen the necessity to really lend their voice to do what is right. And let me close by once again really reaffirming the commitment of the General Assembly to work alongside all organizations and all bodies and all member states that seek to bring justice and development through return of illicitly stolen assets.
Various speakers, including the panelists, seeks urgent action through collaboration and renewed efforts and partnership with the legislature and the rest of society. Some countries like Norway and Switzerland are reported to have been cooperative, but more is required from the rest of Europe. By some estimates, illicit flows from Africa is up to $50 billion each year, which about double the amount the continent receives as assistance. Hopefully, the meeting will strengthen good practices and propel return of the monies to their owners. From New York, Ibrahim Adra, Channels Television News.
Federal Mortgage Bank says Nigeria's housing deficit has risen to 22 million housing units to cater for more than 50% of the country's population, which hovers around 200 million. While various administrations have taken different measures to contain the slide, including the 1999, that would be the 1991 National Housing Policy, the situation seems to be growing from bad to worse. But experts think that viable mortgage system will go a long way in bridging the gap. In continuation of our series on Nigeria's independent anniversary, our correspondent Chris Williams takes a look at developments and deficits in the housing sector.
Rising population, rapid urban migration and inconsistencies in government policies are a few factors said to be widening housing deficit in the country. With a workforce that barely gets 30,000 naira as minimum wage, the answer to the question, do you have a house, asked some workers across the country, is the same.
I don't have a house of my own.
No,
I don't have a house.
Yes and no. Why I said yes and no is because I don't have a house. I've been trying to build one for so many years, but I've not been able to complete it.
According to Jaswile Sendu, a real estate developer, besides the financial implication, the processes involved in acquiring property in the country are too tedious.
I think government should help improve on how people should own the title documents. Because in Nigeria, it takes a minimum of 105 days, which is too much, to own a governor's consent. Meanwhile, in Ghana, that's just nearby, it should take you just 6 procedures to get a document in a week.
As far back as 2014, the population of Nigerians living in the slum and unplanned settlement was put at 50.2% by the World Bank. This meant they had no access to potable water, hygiene, and sanitation. However, the government on its part in 1991, when the country's housing deficit was still 7 million housing units, promulgated a national housing policy in order to provide shelters for Nigerians. By 1997, an urban development policy was initiated. This was followed by a new housing policy in 2012 that should see the country construct 1 million houses annually to augment the deficit.
The increase in the housing deficit figure does not suggest that houses are not being built, except that some of these new builds are located in highbrow areas and they are left unoccupied as a result of either size, design, or high rentals.
In 2017, the present administration commenced the construction of houses in 33 states for workers under its national housing scheme, which pilot was to deliver 2,736 units across the country. But it also appears the average civil servant is not carried along.
Maybe when they build it, they share it among their friends and colleagues and brothers, but it hasn't got to the grassroots.
While many experts think a functional mortgage system is very important in plugging this gap, Abiodun Adeniji, an infrastructure expert, also thinks urban regeneration and collaboration will be very helpful.
What is supposed to be is a supply-led economy, whereby supply those infrastructure, let people connect to it.
Efforts may have been made by successive administrations to plug this gap. Yet, 22 million housing deficit stares us in the face. At the moment, with housing construction put at about 100,000 units per annum, plugging the gap will take over 220 years, assuming current population figure remains constant. Chris Elams, Channels Television News.